My name is Carol Probion. I'm the library's director, and I am standing in right now for Jude, who couldn't be here tonight. First, some housekeeping. As you know, there are exit doors here, and if you go out and to the left, that's the other exit door. The restrooms are to your right when you go out this door. We are honored tonight to have Scott Eckers launching his second book, The Hidden History of East Meadow. And as you know, his first book was entitled East Meadow, and it was published by Arcadia Publishing. So I'd like to welcome him here again. And thank you so much, Scott. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Hello, good evening, and thank you for coming out. What a nice, thank you. So we're here tonight to talk about East Meadow. So because it is the fall, I thought I'd start with a fun, sort of Halloween theme. If you live at 1507 North Jerusalem Road, you're living on top of a cemetery. So that's right. See, these are the fun things, the hidden history of East Meadow. Is that anybody here tonight? No, it's all right. They're possessed for another. All right. So that's actually, that is the Smith family cemetery. It's literally at 1507 North Jerusalem Road. It's one of the only houses that is on an irregularly shaped plot of land, which to somebody like me who studies genealogy and local history is a red flag that something's up with that property. So through some digging, no pun intended, I discovered that in fact was the burial ground of the Moses Smith family who lived on what became the Barnum property. So for those of you who are, how many of you currently live in East Meadow? Almost everybody. Oh my goodness, okay. And some of you were living in East Meadow, but no longer do. Okay. So East Meadow is split, of course, into some very identifiable neighborhoods, right? And one of the things that I'm going to do tonight, is to actually take you through some of those neighborhoods and give you the little history behind all these neighborhoods. Because if you live in a house in East Meadow that was not built in the last literally 10 or 20 years, you are living in a planned baby boom development for the most part. And some of you might be living in an earlier house from an earlier baby boom time after the First World War. And very, very, very few of you might be living in a house that is older than that. One of the things that I did in my book, and I'm very, very proud of this because it took, when I say a year, I literally mean a year, but I went in and I found the records of every neighborhood in East Meadow, right? And what I did was I mapped out on a Google map, which is available on my website and now also in this book, every neighborhood and literally the line around every single neighborhood, including every house in that neighborhood. And then the book goes through the name of the neighborhood, and some of them have really interesting names, who built it, any interesting stories behind why it was built. For instance, if you live on the numbered streets by the water tower, anybody over there? That was a restricted community, Christians only, built in 1926, at a time when the rest of East Meadow was not restricted, which is very interesting. So little tidbits of information like that you can find in the narrative, and I'll go through some of that tonight. And of course, if you live in Salisbury, is anybody here from the Salisbury area? Okay, great. A lot of this book documents East Meadow, and a bunch of it documents the Salisbury area. And what I found doing the East Meadow history book was that Salisbury was maybe the most interesting area of East Meadow in terms of the stories of the people who came before us. There were more murders per capita up in Salisbury when I was doing this book than you could even believe. I was like, again? Another one? But all of these people were really famous and really rich, right? And so I'm going through these names of these Gilded Age estates that were in Salisbury. For those of you who don't realize that, there were Gilded Age estates in Salisbury. And for some reason, it was really popular to kill your husband at that time, okay? So all the women basically got off of their charges. Nobody was actually jailed because of this, because they either feigned insanity or they were just so rich that nobody cared, which is crazy to me today. But so I found that very, very interesting. And then, I don't know, maybe it's because I went to Barnum Wood School, I spent a lot of time on the Barnums, right? The Barnum family in East Meadow. For those of you who don't know, right, Merrick Avenue up until like around 1930s was Barnum Avenue, okay? And the Barnums owned the largest property in Queens County. All right, this was Queens County until 1898, right? So the Barnums owned the largest property. He owned 2,500 acres in East Meadow on the west side of what was then known as Barnum Avenue, alternatively known as Whale Neck Road. And of course, there's a smaller Whale Neck Road that runs semi-parallel to that, an older one, right, the Little Whale Neck Road. And that's because it goes to the Whale Neck in Merrick. So it subsequently was renamed Merrick Avenue. But anyway, the Barnums I found very fascinating. So back to the Moses Smith Cemetery, right? Well, okay, of course we have Smiths here because everybody is named Smith, right, back in 1800. So if we go very, very way back to the history of early East Meadow, we're talking 18th century East Meadow. The oldest records that I was able to find from East Meadow are Town of Hempstead records. So, and these are the ones that if you've read other East Meadow history pamphlets or the books, my other book, or just Town of Hempstead histories on like one-page things online and places, you know, as the story goes, you have settlers who came down from Connecticut. They bought land here from Native Americans. They were granted a patent. They formed the town of Hempstead, et cetera, et cetera. The earliest settlers of East Meadow were literally off the Mayflower. And these are names that lasted in East Meadow for generations. For instance, closer to where I live by Woodland Middle School. And of course, in my book, I do not go by modern names. So the only reference you will find to Woodland in my book is to the Woodland Junior High School. I think everybody can understand that. Okay. It's like I have a house upstate in the Catskills. And if you're familiar with that area, everything there is like what used to be there. There's actually nothing there anymore. It's like I just refer to things as like, well, it's by the Concord Hotel, right? That does not exist anymore, but that's where it is. Okay. So same thing here. We refer to things by their mid-century names generally. Anyway, over in my area, my neck of the woods, the biggest family who lived there was the Fish family. All right. So you had right on the corner across from what used to be Oberle's Florist, you had the Fish family, and they were there for something like 5 or 6 generations. And doing research, local research, involves doing a lot of genealogical research. And so my book is like part genealogical of early families of East Meadow. And if you're doing any kind of East Meadow genealogy, it's actually probably a pretty good resource. The fun part about the people who lived in East Meadow before 1850, like before the Civil War, was that at some point most of them were related to each other. And so doing a history of East Meadow is sort of like doing a family tree of like descendants of the Mayflower who came to East Meadow, founded the Methodist Episcopal Church on Newbridge Avenue, which is East Meadow Avenue for those of you who are newcomers. And basically they all married each other and they weren't like, it wasn't like they married their cousins, but like after a while it seemed like everybody was like cousins with everybody else. So, and then what made it even harder to do some of the research on the names like the Fish family, the Carmens, okay, the Browers, which is a name that is not known to most people in this crowd, but after you read my book tonight, you will be like, wow, okay, the Browers, these people were nuts, all right? It was a little bit like the Hatfields and the McCoys. We'll get to that in a little bit. But these people, they all ended up marrying, and the Smiths, of course, right? So they all married each other. Interestingly enough, the Barnums did not get involved with these families. So for those of you living in the Barnum Woods area there, you know, he was very rich, okay? And so with that kind of money comes like sort of a level of sophistication where like you go to Manhattan to find spouses for your kids. And that's exactly what they did. However, there are no living descendants of the Barnums. Okay, so I guess that didn't work out for them in the long run, but we'll get to all of that. So very briefly here, this here, of course, if you have been in East Meadow long enough, this is the first property we'll talk about here. This today is an LED lighting store on Hempstead Turnpike, not this building, but this is the Carmen homestead. very famous painting, and the reason I started with this, of course, is that you can find, was this hanging up in the library originally? I think this has been around. And this is a painting from the 1880s over here, and this building lasted another 100 years after that, okay? So the property of what's now East Meadow High School, and just south and west of that was the Carmen and Loudon property. These were two very, very famous names in East Meadow. Again, these are families that married each other. The Carmens were some of the original settlers in the town of Hempstead. If you go to the churchyard by the town hall and you look through the names there, you'll find these people like buried in that like 1600s churchyard over there. And then they came here to East Meadow. The name East Meadow, of course, comes from the fact that it's east of the village of Hempstead. Hempstead in Germanic languages basically is like the main spot in town, okay? And so when they came here, that's where it was. And then so the East Meadow is good for grazing their cattle and their sheep. So everybody came out here, and water was very important. One of the stories that you'll read in my book is literally about water. And the Meadow Brook became advantageous to watering, right, giving water to your animals. So people came out here to East Meadow, and they settled here. And all of the land east of the Meadow Brook, and of course the Meadow Brook is today mostly gone, right? The Meadow Brook Parkway is mostly in its stead. There are a few areas of the Meadow Brook that are still occasionally wet, but not so much. Down towards Merrick, there's more of it, okay? So east of the Meadow Brook, you had what was called the East Meadow Hollow. And the East Meadow Hollow was described in 17th century records essentially as being a good place for grazing your animals. And so what they did was they held all of the land basically in that section in common. And what that means is that they own it collectively. It's owned by the town, and everybody gets to use it, right? So what do? You have your own cattle, you have your own sheep and your goats and things like that. And every spring, you take your animals and you earmark them and you send them out to graze in the East Meadow Hollow, okay? And your animals drink the water and whatever, graze on the grasses. This whole area was grassland. There were very, very few trees in East Meadow at the time. And at the end of the season in the fall, there would be an event in East Meadow called Sheep Parting Day. And everybody would go to the commons, just the big grassy areas, and they would look for their animals with their tags, and they would take them in for the winter, or slaughter them, or whatever they were going to do with them. And then it turned into like a big carnival in East Meadow in the 19th century. So they'd have parting day festivities, and that was the biggest thing in East Meadow. Well, in the 1800s, in the 1700s, there were laws that were enacted for East Meadow and for the other parts of the town of Hempstead that dealt with common lands. And that was, if you owned property around the common lands, you were forced to put up fences there to keep the animals in. And so you had privileges based on how much fence you had, right? And it was your responsibility to keep the fences in good condition, or you'd get fined from the town. And they, in fact, took this so seriously that one of the things I learned in doing the research was that in the 17th century, they created laws, and the 18th century, rather, they created laws about the fences, and then they hired people to enforce the law, right? So you had people going around and checking to make sure that people's fences were in good order and things like that. And this guy was paid in like butter, okay? Because of course that's important to us. So basically East Meadow was very sleepy for from the 1600s when it was sort of settled. If you come into town on Hempstead Turnpike, there's a sign that's like, "Welcome to East Meadow," like established 1917. This is just wrong. I have no idea where that number comes from. My guess is it's a Chamber of Commerce sign. Perhaps the Chamber of Commerce was established around that time, which would make sense. Although I don't think it was. I think it was a little bit later. So I'm not sure where that number comes from. But there's never been an establishment of East Meadow because East Meadow has no government, right? So there's no village here. It's just the town of Hempstead. The identity comes from the school district, okay? The East Meadow School District was organized as the Brush in 1812, all right? And then the state gave everybody 2 years to figure out what the borders of their districts were going to be. Because in 1812, New York State enacted a common school law, And they forced towns in 1812 to establish public schools in every single town. And it was up to the town to determine what the borders of those public school districts were going to be. And then they set their own tax rates, much like today. And they had one person who would be the trustee for that district and a tax collector. And that's how the districts function. And so in 1814, the East Meadow School District was created, and it has been continuously operating since then. All right, so we are one of the original New York State school districts. On Long Island, there are more original school districts like East Meadow than anywhere else in New York State. That's because in the rest of the state, they all consolidated with each other in like the 1940s and 50s. Right, so you have central school districts in most of the state. Here on Long Island, we value local control over everything else, and so we have never let go of our like 1 square mile school districts here. So as a result, East Meadow schools can trace their history straight back to 1812, okay, which I think is fascinating. So we'll go through some of the pictures I have here. Again, this is the Carmen property. This is on the cover of the book, of my new book here, and of course comes by way of Dr. Hefner, who's sitting here in the front row. And this right here is something you've seen many times if you live in East Meadow. There's a bank that's no longer open at the corner of Merrick Avenue and Hempstead Turnpike next to Borelli's. They have this big picture in there. Well, the fun fact about that picture is that it has been edited. This is the original picture. So I don't really know why. It doesn't seem so offensive to me, but there's a bunch of dead rabbits in this picture that the TD Bank thought would be offensive to their clients. So, like, I'm not a hunter, but I mean, you know, come on. So that was edited out of the big picture on the wall, but this is a hunting party, okay? They are going hunting. And what was the number one thing that you did in East Meadow? I don't know what happened here, I'm sorry, but there it is. What was the number one thing that you did in East Meadow if you were going to be high society in like the late 1800s here? You went on like fox hunts, all right? Yeah. So there was a club, not really in East Meadow, like right on the border of East Meadow and what would today be, I guess, like East Garden City or Uniondale, called the Meadowbrook Club. All right. However, it is so linked with the history of East Meadow that you cannot come to an East Meadow presentation and walk away without knowing anything about the Meadowbrook Club. The Meadowbrook Club lasted in its position there until the 1950s when the, you know, just development forced them into Jericho. So technically the club still exists in Jericho. That's like a golf club. And like everything else, it followed the trends of the time. So this was just west of Merrick Avenue, across from like the little, you know, like the Lannon House in Eisenhower Park and like where the lake is over there, sort of in that area. On the western side of Merrick Avenue, in the area that's now like, is it Endo Boulevard over there? That section, there's some, okay. So some stuff over there. Near like Nassau Community College and that. So there was the Meadowbrook Club, and at first, the biggest thing they did was they would go hunting, right? So they would get their dogs, and they would follow the scent, right? And they would go all over the brushy plains, which was an early name for East Meadow, and that was essentially everything from here to Farmingdale, or like Plain Edge. All right, and so they would have these great big hunts, and they weren't so interested even really in the hunting. That was the fun part. The more you read about the stories of the people who did these hunts, they couldn't really care less about the hunt. It's like people who go to, like, I don't even know, like people who go like bowling and stuff, right? It's like a drinking club, but they also bowl, you know, that kind of thing. So like at the Meadowbrook Club, they hunted like, you know, like fox hunts and like drag hunts, they called. But it was more of like a social thing. And as the social things changed, so did they. So they adapted. So the next thing that was big at the turn of the century in the early 1900s was polo, right? So these people were all interested in high society folks played polo, all right? And who started moving into the area? It was people associated with the Meadowbrook Club. And these people owned horses, all right? And so where did they choose to live? In places where other people owned horses. And where was that? That was Salisbury, primarily, okay? So I don't know if anybody's been in East Meadow a long time. Do you know where the Salisbury School is? It's now the district office, okay? Again, I call it the Salisbury School because that's how it was built. Notice that it's built on an oval. The school itself is circular. okay? If it was a racetrack, okay? That was a horse racing track. So that is there on the Ladenburg property, right? And there's all the streets in East Meadow are named for these people, so you can't get away from them. The Ladenburg property was later sold to the Bolson family before it became houses, which is why all those names are up there. And they created, along with Teddy Roosevelt's brother, they created what they call colony of homes for people who were really in the Meadowbrook Club. All right, so this was basically, so the Ladenburg home property was called the Oasis, all right, because it was like they brought in trees from Europe over there, so they created like an oasis on the plains, and then so they lived there, and then he went into business with Elliott Roosevelt. Okay, so Elliott Roosevelt owned a home in the Meadowbrook Park colony, also up there in the Salisbury area. They're next to each other. They're all friends. They all like hung out. Elliott Roosevelt was Teddy Roosevelt's brother. Unfortunately, Elliott was a drug addict, okay? And he spent his days at the club doing a little bit too much clubbing, all right? And as a result, his family actually confined him to like an institution overseas to try to get him to like sober up a little bit. Unfortunately, it didn't really work, and when he came back here, he kind of died like an alcoholic. His daughter, you may have heard of, right? Her name is Eleanor Roosevelt. Okay, so she ended up living with her grandparents after that, but when Eleanor Roosevelt was a child, she lived here in East Meadow on Newbridge Avenue, okay? Which again, Newbridge Avenue is East Meadow Avenue today, but to make it more complicated, Newbridge Avenue, where she lived, is called Salisbury Park Drive today, okay? Right, it's confusing because Salisbury Park Drive used to connect straight through Eisenhower Park to East Meadow Avenue. That was one street, all right? So if you look at maps, which I love doing, you can't do a project like this without looking at maps, you'll see straight lines through what's now the park. You'll see Stewart Avenue going straight from Garden City all the way through the park, which is why there's a Stewart Avenue by Bowling Green School that doesn't seem to connect to anything else, right? But it's actually the same road that is no longer a road, right? So you have all these, anyway, so the Roosevelts lived over there. It took me years, not like continuously, but like here and there. It took me years to actually locate where these properties were. Because everybody always says, well, it was at the corner of such and such, right? But A, those roads didn't all exist at the time, right? B, the property lines are not the same. C, there's no photographs from these time periods because the only pictures we have are aerial photos, right? But the earliest aerial photos we have of East Meadow are from 1926. So anything before that's a big question mark. And then so you go back to these maps. And so, for instance, you have the Belcher Hyde map from 1906 at the time, all right, which is the Bible of local history for anything at the turn of the century. And by that time, some of these families are gone already. So then you have to go back to earlier stuff, and it's very hard to find. I finally located this. So if you're looking for the Roosevelt house here, it is on the north side of Valentine's Road, okay, up in Salisbury, at the corner of, right, Salisbury Park Drive and Valentine's Road. But it's not right there, okay? All right, so that is a long-winded story about what they were doing here. They're hunting, and of course, this was sold in 1914 to the Hefners, who held this property the longest. This building today is called the Noon Inn, and it sits at the old Bethpage Village restoration. It was moved there in the 1960s, I think by truck, okay? And it continues to sell essentially root beer and big pretzels to kids. At the time, this was East Meadow's hotel, all right? And this was where the pool is today, all right? So piece by piece. Oh, they numbered the sections. Oh, wooden dowels. My goodness. Impressive. I don't know how they did that. How did these people make money? It wasn't actually renting out hotel rooms. The only reason they had hotel rooms in here is that so they can get a state liquor license. All right. This hotel had 2 rooms. All right. the one on the left and the one on the right. All right. Downstairs was, Mr. Schultz's bar. And that's basically how they made money. And it became like the hangout for political scene. So East Meadow had a very strong political scene starting in the late 1800s when you started getting immigrants coming here. The immigration patterns and the political patterns follow very much the rest of the country. So you had the earliest English settlers, right, from the 17th century, 18th century here. Once you get after the Civil War, what you start seeing is German immigrants to East Meadow. Okay, so East Meadow has significant sections in the late 1800s and early 1900s of the Klein Deutschland, as they say. There was even a German language mutual benefit association here in East Meadow for the people who are of German origin. And where did all these people live? Most of them lived up Carmen Avenue. Okay, and down Belmore Road, not Belmore Avenue, but Belmore Road. This is by Parkway Elementary School, for those of you familiar with that area. And so the Germans in that area, if you think that the earliest English settlers kept marrying each other and it's complicated to follow, just wait till you see the chapter in my book on Klein Deutschland. Because not only did they all marry each other, all right, but they gave their kids the same name as the parents, like all the time, okay? But it gets more complicated because it's not just the boys that got their father's names, but the girls in these German communities were given their mother's names also, okay? So trying to follow the properties through these generations of Germans in East Meadow was the most complicated genealogy that I had to deal with in doing this book, okay? Because how many Marys can you have in one family? And there's 4 of them living at one time, and it's like grandmother, and the mother and child, and everybody's named the same thing. So I found that to be really interesting. These people in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was the Germans of East Meadow that were connected primarily with the democratic machine in New York. And the Methodist Episcopal Church / Old English settlers, right, was the opposite. So you had a very clear delineation there. And anyway, so the political party, literally party of the Germans met in the hotels. And there were 2 hotels of note in East Meadow. The first one was the East Meadow Hotel, which later became known as like the Andrew Hefner Hotel, or the Noon Inn earlier on. And then you had the New Bridge Hotel up at the corner of Newbridge Road, okay, not Newbridge Avenue, but Newbridge Road, the one that exists today, and Old Westbury Road up there, okay? So you had, there was a hotel, it was kind of right across the street from the fire department up on Newbridge Road over there. And that was the Keistling Hotel. And the Keistlings had that whole property there. He brought over a son-in-law from Germany, and they were farmers, and then they went into the hotel business. And in fact, the Keistling Hotel, the Newbridge Hotel up there, was the center of activity and we have Howard Kroplik here today, who also actually is a fellow author, when we had the races, right? So there were automobile races through East Meadow. I mean, I don't know if you've seen pictures of these in my original book here, or in Mr. Kroplik's book, but you have, the Vanderbilts racing their toys through East Meadow here on the motor parkway, what we would call motor parkway today, okay? And the best place to watch that was from Mr. Keistling's second story, right? So people went up there, and he made a lot of money off of this because, right? I mean, there's drinks to be sold at all of these occasions, which is seems to be a central theme in how to make money in 1908 in East Meadow. All right, so that is, exactly. And the same thing with the Carmens, the picture I showed you a few minutes ago. They owned an inn over there. Again, that inn was a couple of rooms, all right? But it was the only inn at the time on the Hempstead, the Bethpage Turnpike, really. All right, so moving on. We're spending a lot of time on this. All right, let's go to... All right, the Spriggs. This is crazy, So some of the hidden history, again, a lot of murders and things like that. The Spriggs, this is Sealy Sprigg, otherwise spelled Selah, S-E-L-A-H, or S-E-E-L-E-Y, or S-E-A-L-E-Y, or another one of 10 different ways that newspapers in the 1800s spelled this guy's name. The Spriggs were big landowners here in East Meadow. In fact, this property, like right here, was a Sprigg property. It was sold to the school district at some point. Because this used to be a school, right? Everybody knows that? Okay, so until 1950 when the school burned down, and then like 10 years later they built a library here. So, but the property the state forced the school district to like expand their properties basically like around the turn of the century so the kids have a place to play, novel activity. So the school district ended up like buying land like next to it. So this is a Sprague property over here. But the Spriggs mostly lived in what's now Eisenhower Park, okay, and north of Conti Square, that area over there. I'm throwing out a lot of street names because everybody's from East Meadow, so I figured you know what I'm talking about. So that is the Colony Diner. We go by diners on Long Island. Right, yeah. Well, where is that near? I don't know. It's near the Apollo Diner, right? All right. So this is behind the Colony Diner, which is also not the original name, by the way. But much like the hotels I was discussing in the Catskills earlier this evening, diners on Long Island were meant to be burned down and rebuilt. So a lot of them were. Anyway, behind that diner, you had the Sprague family, and they lived there for 350 years. All right. And the last Sprague was forced out when the county built Eisenhower Park. And they moved her house to Jerusalem Avenue, number 910, Jerusalem Avenue. It's not there anymore. I did go by and check, of course. And that's actually not really East Meadow. It's actually Uniondale today. It's across from like Turtle Hook Junior High School. Anyway, so they moved her house there. But they lived there for 350 years. And one of the Spriggs was this guy, Sealy. Now, Sealy and his wife, Sarah, these guys got attacked by this guy, Charles Rugg. And Charles Rugg was this, he had been involved in Oyster Bay in a crime that involved a family called Maybe. All right, so it was the Maybe murders up in Oyster Bay. And then he somehow was on the run for a while. They didn't know who it was. And then he almost murdered these people here in East Meadow while they were around in their farm, okay, up on the, in that property in what's behind East Meadow High School. And this became like the trial of, the decade over there in East Meadow. They caught this guy, Charles Rugg. He hit him with it's called a fish plate. So at first, when I first did this research, I'm like, what is a fish plate? Like, do you put like salmon on it? I mean, but it turns out it's what you tie rails together with on a railroad. So it's like it's about this big, and like if you ever look at the side of rails, there's like some bolts holding them together. That's a fish plate. So he hits him with a fish plate. They survive. A lot of people survived these amazing injuries back in like the 1880s. It's amazing. And then they were able to pin this attempted murder on this guy, and the locals here in East Meadow tracked this guy down, and they were going to lynch him. All right? And so this guy Rugg, right? So he was half African American and half Native American, and so these people, they were following him. He gets arrested, and the people of East Meadow were like, let's like string this guy up from like the nearest tree. Okay? Well, enough people in East Meadow had the good sense, even during that time period, to be like, this would not look good. Okay? I know it sounds kind of humorous and all. It's like kind of meant to be a little bit humorous, but realistically, there were enough people with common sense to go, we cannot have vigilante justice in East Meadow, okay, at this point in our history. And you're talking here a long time ago. It was after the Civil War, so obviously there are fresh wounds in the United States. And you all know that what's going on in the South in the Jim Crow era with people accused of crimes who were African American, I mean, lynched constantly, of course, extrajudicially, we call that. So anyway, that did not happen. They put the people of East Meadow stopped their neighbors, and turns out the guy was arrested, and, well, he ended up getting executed in a similar fashion, but at least it was, okay, like, through the state kind of thing. But this guy, Rugg, here's the crazy part. He's involved in this other section of East Meadow where crime was rampant. So there is a section of East Meadow on the corner of North Jerusalem Road and Newbridge Road, okay? And today there's like a Walgreens over there, and the guy who fixes my car, all right, and that new gas station that has free air, by the way. So, but at the time, it was that. Remember I said it was all German in like the 1880s? Well, that area of East Meadow, 20 years later, becomes Little Italy. Okay, that whole area is like East Meadow's Little Italy, and there are, I don't even know, dozens, hundreds, I don't even know, of Italian families in that section. And the number one family who lived there, and I don't know if it's Sabia or Sabia, sorry if you lived in the area longer than me, you would know this, but Sabia's Corner, or Sabia's Corner, is what they called it, because that family owned pretty much every property on the corner there. Today there's a nursery school on the corner there, right? Yeah, Big Chief. That is one of their homes. And there's also a home directly across the street behind the mechanic. There's two of them, and they are much, much older than you think. They've just been updated. And those are homes from the Sabia family there. Beyond that, that right beyond, if you go east towards the Meadow, to Wantagh Parkway from over there, all right, those areas and south toward like the Belmore and what used to be called like the Jerusalem, Wantagh Avenue area over there, you had an area that was known to be like the lowest class part of East Meadow in like 1900. Like you don't go down like Newbridge Road from East Meadow in 1900. Like you're gonna end up in like the wrong part of town. This sounds really funny because like literally everybody is a farmer, okay? But what happened was all the families in that neighborhood got involved in all sorts of like sort of at the time perceived to be like low class like businesses and things like that. And he had this guy Brower, all right? And he lived, he had two properties. One of them was where Oberle's is today, or was, okay? And the other one was at the other corner, so of like North Jerusalem and Newbridge, right? And this guy gets involved with every woman in town. All right. Yeah, that's I think the nicest way of saying that. And so this family here, and he has this wife, and he decides that like his, wife, she's getting a little bit older. You know how this goes. I mean, the story's same today on like page 6 of, the paper. So he ends up getting involved with this other woman from the area, and she had been married like 3 times. All right. And the people in town could not figure out who this lady actually was, because she went by like 3 different last names. Mrs. So-and-so, right? Like 3 different people. And Rugg, the guy who murdered or attempted murder, right, of the Spriggs, and then murdered the people in Oyster Bay, he's living in this part of town too. So like the whole area is getting a bad rep, all right? And so you have this love triangle there that ends up, if you read the book, all right, I don't want to give away the whole thing, but one thing here that happens is that they end up literally having like this Wild West shootout here where they're eloping in a wagon down Newbridge Road, laughing at the spouse that they're like leaving for the younger one, all right? To which point the other guy comes out and they're shooting at the wagon, okay? So these are some of the hidden history stories that I dug up that I'm looking forward to you reading because I think they're kind of fun, even though these people were kind of not fun people. But nobody ended up getting killed in any of these like shootouts, which I, thank God. But anyway, they all end up in jail, right? So the father ends up in jail because of his, trysts there. And then what happens is his son does the exact same thing, essentially, with other women, and he ends up at Sing Sing with his father. Yeah. So this whole Brower, I call it the Brower clan, I think, in my book, because, like, it's basically like the Hatfields and the McCoys over there on Newbridge Road in North Jerusalem, right around that time. To make this more fun, you'll see a picture in the book of the guy's lawyer, all right, George Mott. Now, the lawyer, he makes this deal with Brower that he's going to defend him in court and stuff, but he has to sign over essentially all his property to him. All right? So he does that. What they don't realize is that the wife is still living on the farm, the one that he left, right? But the lawyer doesn't really care because he wants his property, his money. Finally, they go back and they leave the wife some property, like part of that property right there, like where that Big Chief area is. And then a few years later, Mott he's like, I'm going to move to East Meadow. So the guy moves to East Meadow, and then, of course, how do you get ahead in East Meadow at the turn of the century? You got to be involved with the Methodist Episcopal Church. This church still stands, by the way. Okay, it's that old frame church on East Meadow Avenue, the one with the cemetery behind it that you may have, okay. You know there's a cemetery there? But there's only a few headstones that still stand. But I have the cemetery records. If anybody is deadly interested, you can find me. Okay, so it is at East Meadow Avenue, and it's near like Park, Stuyvesant, that area over there. All right. What is it called? Harton Avenue. Thank you. Just past the post office, on the other side of the street. The new church, the new Methodist church, which today is called United Methodist Church, is sort of across the street and down just a little bit. The new United Methodist Church was built on the land that was originally the parsonage for the church across the street. And so that's still the United Methodist Church cemetery behind the church, but they sold it to another congregation. So Mott gets involved with the church. And so what do you want to do at that time when you want to get ahead? You donate money to the church, right? So he's like, I'm going to donate the library to the Sunday school at the church. And that created a controversy in the church because do they accept his donation? All right? And so this goes back and forth, and this is all the newspapers. I read several thousand newspaper articles to write this book. Like, I don't even know. I have a list, believe it or not. The work cited for this book is nearly as long as the second half of the book, so I didn't include it in the book. But I think at some point I'll make it available like online, or maybe I'll print it out and leave a copy in the library here. So like you'll see in the book, it'll be like Brooklyn Daily Eagle, and then like a list of like 70 years, right? But there's like 500 articles in there that I read. Like that, so if you're looking at the works cited list, I hope that makes sense. That kind of thing. So anyway, this guy Mott, eventually they take his books, all right? And he becomes, he was married 3 times, and the church didn't want to take his books, not because of his lawyering with the Browers and their clan, but because he had been married several times. And so that was like against the church teachings. So they didn't want to accept his books. But eventually, when they saw the price tag, which was free, they took the books, and they forgave him for his marital sins, I guess, at the time. The other people involved in the church at that time, just after the turn of the century, like 1900s, we might call it, okay? 1910s, like that area there, was a professor, this guy, Frederick Grube. And he was a professor of languages, and he ended up teaching he was a high school teacher in the city, but he was a college professor. And he becomes like a minor celebrity in East Meadow just after the turn of the century. So his first wife died, and he remarried, and he moved his family here to Prospect Avenue. At the time, Prospect Avenue only went from Merrick Avenue to what's now East Meadow Avenue, okay? It was not until the 1920s that Prospect Avenue was extended to Hempstead Turnpike. So at the time, it was called Hay Carter's Lane because the people carted hay, essentially, from the open fields by the water tower now back to the farms, like the Barnum property. And Grube lived on Hay Carter's Lane, and he had a summer home there. East Meadow becomes very fashionable right around the turn of the century for summer homes for wealthy and influential people from New York City. And so his summer home was called Gothic Cottage. And it took me 5 years to locate Gothic Cottage. That's dedication. I finally found Gothic Cottage. Because if you look at maps from the early 1900s, they're not exact. So you see, they give the names of the people who live on the streets, but they're more like there's 10 people who live on the street, so on the right-hand side of the street, I'm just going to write 10 names, okay? And you don't always know really where their properties are. So I knew this guy, Frederick Grubé, lived somewhere southwest of Coakley Avenue. Okay? And I could not figure out where. And finally, after literally thousands of newspaper articles, when I was doing research on the history of East Meadow Jewish Center, I found in 1954 or 5 or something, whenever they were first dedicating the building, okay, the East Meadow Jewish Center is dedicating their new building at their new location at Gothic Cottage. Okay? And so I was able to pinpoint this thing at East Meadow Jewish Center. So that's where Frederick Grubé lived. That whole area was the Demon property for a while after that. Okay? Right? You probably know all these names. Like Demon Lane. All that. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we did the Germans. We did the Italians. Who moved to East Meadow right after that? Polish people. Okay? Poles and Ukrainians. Okay? And a lot of these families are still here. So I happen to be on the Board of Education here in East Meadow, and I know a lot of our incredible staff, and I can tell you that the vast majority of our custodial staff here is of Ukrainian descent. It's fascinating. And last year, when the war started between Russia and Ukraine, this really impacted a lot of the employees of the school district. They can trace their heritage mostly to about 1930 here from East Meadow. And so, again, you see greater immigration patterns coming here. They mostly settled in the what's now East Meadow Avenue area. So there is the Polish church. It's a Polish Catholic church, okay, which is in that, right off of East Meadow Avenue, in that neighborhood right there, in what the neighborhood was the O.L. Schwenke built neighborhood in the 20s, and they took some of the sections of the lots, and they built a Polish church there. That whole area became very Polish. So you have a deli, the Gniew, Niewinek. I don't know how to pronounce that exactly. I apologize if you're Polish. And then that became Winnicki, exactly. And that today's Major Steakhouse, all right? So that was like a Polish establishment over there. And then the other kind of fun story dealing with especially like Slavs and churches here in East Meadow is that there also happens to be an Orthodox church here in East Meadow, okay? The one that you may have passed, it's very ornate. That is the second Orthodox church here in East Meadow. There was an original one, it was knocked down, and they built a new one, more like mid-century. The original one, this is a really crazy story. The congregants of this church, along with their priest, purchased several lots in one of the new developments in the 1920s. The 1920s was a time of great development in East Meadow, but not like baby boom development. Just basically splitting up East Meadow into lots, like in the 20s. And so the leader of that church and the congregants purchase a lot in this huge empty area of East Meadow, and they're like, all right, we're going to build a church here because our people are settling in this area. Great. All right? So they build this church. It's impressive. They dedicate it. They find out, like, soon after that they build the church literally on the wrong lot. They bought the one next to it. All right? Now, lots in East Meadow were apportioned at 20 feet wide in the 1920s. And you can always tell if your lot is from the 20s boom in East Meadow or the 50s baby boom, because if you look at your deed, you either live on one lot of land or you live on 3 lots of land. Okay? If you live on 3 lots of land, you live on 3 20-foot sections that were separated in the 20s. If you live on one 60-foot section, like most of us, it's from the 50s. Fun fact. Anyway, so because they're only 20 feet wide, all right, and the church is not that wide to begin with, they bought like 2 lots out of the section. But anyway, it was like 20 feet off. So now the question is, what do? All right? Do you knock down the church, whatever? No. What did they decide to do? They bought the property next to it on which the church stood. But the priest decides they're going to ask the congregants to pay for this thing. The congregants were not having any of this stuff. It's like they're getting taxed on like something that was like this guy's mistake. The guy comes to church and they all stand outside the church and throw raw eggs at him. That sounds like a career ender, except the guy stayed as the priest of the church for several years after that. So I don't understand. I don't know. If people throw raw eggs at me, I'd be looking for a different job. But I guess like Orthodox church leaders, like jobs were hard to come by on Long Island, and the guy stuck around for a while. I love that story. All right, so that's just like, to me, that's fun hidden history of East Meadow. All right, so I do want to talk about the developments in the houses of worship for a little while. Let me just, couple of people I want to show you before I do that. All right, these are the Barnums. You may have seen these pictures before. They were in my original book, too. This is Peter Crosby Barnum, P.C. Barnum. He was not related to the circus guy, okay? Every, like, folklore of East Meadow is like, oh, they used to keep elephants on Merrick Avenue. Okay, no, the guy grew vegetables, okay? And again, he was the largest landowner in Queens County, and he became rich the proper way in 1862, and that is he married this lady, okay? This is Sarah Ann Baldwin, all right, of Baldwin, and her parents founded Baldwin's, Baldwinsville, which then became Baldwin's when she was alive, which is now Baldwin, all right? And so, sorry, I don't know what's going on here. But anyway, so he marries Sarah Ann Baldwin, and the Baldwins own that entire tract west of Merrick Avenue, which now becomes the Barnum property, all right? Anyway, they establish this farm. It grows, it grows, it grows, it grows. They become really rich, and he goes into the clothing business. So Peter Crosby Barnum opens a clothing store at, I think it's the Bowery in New York City. Large clothing store. Goes into it with his family, and they make a lot of money. And so he expands his farm, and Sarah Ann, the wife, she stays here in East Meadow while P.C. Barnum is in Manhattan at their other house in Manhattan, raising their kids. All right, he had a kid from an earlier marriage who ended up owning the land across the street on which is now Lakeville Estates, up towards where like the Mab liquor store used to be up until like a month ago. All right, so anyway, that's like his first kid's property. But he has two kids. Joshua Barnum is one of them, and Joshua Barnum and Kate Vale Barnum. And the two of them inherit their father's property after he dies, or mother dies in 1893. Sarah Ann Barnum is way more important in East Meadow history than P.C. Barnum, okay? East Meadow is full of what we might call feminists today, and she was one of them. And she became an honorary member of like the town board, basically. And everything that she said, she got. And every vote that was taken in the town, she influenced. And it was Sarah Ann Barnum that convinced the town of Hempstead to sell the common lands that I was talking about earlier today, okay, to create Garden City and to create the private land. All right, so that's where you get like, you know, Stewart and all of them in. So she is best known, I don't know why the picture's not loading, she is best known not just for creating the sale of the common lands, all right, but for opening the poorhouse in Nassau County. So there is something called Barnum Island today, Island Park. It's Oceanside, basically, between Oceanside and Long Beach. It's named for her, not for him. And that's because she found out that the conditions at the town poorhouse were deplorable, and she becomes like a humanitarian. And she goes in the middle of the night when she finds out that they are going to sell this island. She takes like a rowboat from Oceanside. She gets there, she buys the property before anybody else has a chance to bid on it, and then she turns the property over at no cost to the public to build like a welfare home, okay? And so she becomes very famous, like a philanthropist because of that. And that's Sarah Ann Barnum. The Barnums are the most interesting. So in my first book, I found the most interest in Sarah Ann Barnum. But in this book, I found the most interest actually in her granddaughter, and that's May Barnum. May Barnum So the Barnum home was this huge mansion west of Merrick Avenue, north of the Apollo Diner, okay? And it took me 7 years to locate where this mansion was. Literally last spring, I finally found this home. Because everybody, oh, well, this is the Barnum property. Well, here's Barnum Woods School, right? So there it is. No, it's close, okay? The actual Barnum mansion, which was 4 floors and had a lookout. There's a picture in the book of it, you'll see. So she could look out for this long, long time to see everybody on her farm, was between what's now Andrews, okay, lane there, and there's like a Lakeville lane over there? Anyway, kind of like at that intersection over there. K Manor, that's correct. So K Manor development is built on the epicenter of the Barnum property. So the Barnums own 2,500 acres, like so the whole thing is the Barnum property, but their like homestead is today what we would call K Manor, or in the 50s what we would call K Manor, which is, okay, Andrews Lane. The reason it's called Andrews Lane is because after the Barnums left, okay, you had Silas Andrews buying a lot of their property. And so Silas Andrews was a highway guy in town, but they raised cats. So, yeah, it was literally a cat house, all right? And the reason that they did that is because they bought the property from the Barnums, who, in their last days here, raised dogs. And this is what I found to be the most interesting. The Barnums go from growing vegetables to keeping prized horses on their farm when they became associated with the Meadowbrook Club, okay, to during the polo days. Well, once the polo days dried up and the polo courses became golf courses, then they moved on to dogs, right? So Mae Barnum, the granddaughter of the Barnums we talked about, she inherits this property from her father, Joshua Barnum, who dies in 1906. And so she gets married, and her husband dies immediately. It's a really sad story. They have like a wedding. They have a wedding in the Barnum house, 400 guests, okay? And I assume it was like on the front lawn because I don't think you fit 400 guests in there. And then they decide they're going to build a home. So she gets married right there. Her husband dies the following year, and she gets remarried pretty quickly to this guy Leo Wanner. And Leo Wanner is into dogs. So they build on the Barnum property kennels, and they build a new mansion. They don't want to live in their parents' home. And they rent out their parents' home to a series of wealthy people involved in like all kinds of different stuff. The Andrews being the longest one there. And the Andrews stayed through the 40s, by the way. So if you were around for that time, okay, that's a name that actually, okay. And after the final people who lived in the parents' mansion, okay, were people who ran camps. They started a boarding school for kids over there, and it only lasted a couple of years, but they advertised widely. And they opened a camp upstate called Camp Lenny Lenape. And anyway, that's who lived there. But so anyway, Mae Barnum, she gets married to this guy, Leo Wanner, and she builds another mansion on the property, but behind the property a little bit. And that becomes her, not just her mansion, but also like the kennels that they were going to do there. So now I'm looking for years, and I'm going, all right, I know there's 2 houses here. I know there's 2 houses here, right? Where are these houses? I don't know where the original one is, and I don't know where the May one is. Now, if you look at articles from 1952, the biggest news in East Meadow is that the Barnum Mansion burned down. For the last 8 years, I thought that was the main Barnum Mansion, okay, the one of the grandparents, right? The 4-story cupola, that one, okay? Turns out that's not at all what burns down in 1952. It's the granddaughter's house, which is a mansion in its own right, but not the original one. That house is located on what is now the Barnum Woods Elementary School playground. So that's really the property that's over there. And the way that you can find this house, any of you with kids, is that when you go to the Barnum Woods playground, there are trees. There are a lot of trees on the Barnum Woods property in the back. Those trees on the left-hand side of the playground, that's the tree-lined street that goes to the property from Merrick Avenue. And if you go into the playground, you'll see a bunch of random trees that kind of form a circular pattern. And if you look, you go like, I see that circular pattern. That's their circular driveway. And so their house was right there. And right behind that was their kennels. And it becomes known as the Lawano Kennels. And they bring a famous dog over from the battlefields of France known as Rin Tin Tin. And they keep this dog here on the Barnum property, and it becomes like this movie dog, all right? And they make all this money off of these dogs. But the biggest reason that she becomes famous is that she starts raising police dogs and Red Cross dogs. And they actually use Barnum's dogs to hunt down like murderers, like following the scent here in Nassau County. And I found that fascinating. None of these people had children, so they are the last of the Barnums. And the property was sold off that year, and most of the property then becomes Lakeville Estates, okay, and K Manor. And the property was subdivided in 1906. So all of the properties west of Merrick Avenue are subdivided into something called Meadowbrook Farms. And the Barnum property they called it Meadowbrook Farm. But the property on the west, they created these big boxes of properties. And they look small on the boxes. Today they're really big. Each one of them is 6 houses today. All right? Literally 6 houses today. The size of the property you can gauge because you know that little farm, that little Bosse's farm over there on Merrick Avenue? That's 1 box, okay? That's the only one that remains. There are some houses in that 1906 development there that are still there, but it's only a few of them. So that whole area was mapped. The earliest subdivision in East Meadow is Meadowbrook Farms of the Barnum property. Richmond Road, Wilson, okay, Durham, all of those roads were mapped in 1906. All right, the last one was Wilson. It was called Christian Road at the time. And it went also on the other side of the Meadowbrook. And there was something called Meadowbrook Road on the other side, which was obliterated when they built the Meadowbrook Parkway. And no homes were ever built on it, so that made it kind of easy. But you could see, if you go to the end of Wilson Road and Ludington Road, the original roads there, you see that they actually sort of continue, and they look like they're going to go right over the parkway, and that's because they used to continue on the other side of the parkway. All right. Anyway, that's fun. All right. Finally, I just want to talk about a couple of the developments here. East Meadow in the 1920s was fascinating. You had this guy Gross who built, they weren't really selling homes as much as they were selling properties. And the biggest thing that was happening at that time was aviation on the plains. They really latched onto that. In fact, one of the earliest developments up Carmen Avenue was called Aviation Park. And as a pun, I like to say it never took off. There were 0 houses built in Aviation Park because all these people were like a little overzealous that people were going to move to East Meadow in 1925, and then people like kind of didn't. But what they did do is buy land. And so some of the people who sold land even provided guarantees. If your land does not increase in value X number of percent, right, over the next number of years, we're going to like refund this amount of money, whatever. They didn't ever have to refund that money because the land, of course, did increase in value. And the way they sold this land in the 20s is that they took people out from the city and they drove them here and they provided excursions. Hey, come look at this beautiful land and buy this property, all right? And this could be yours for like very little money. So people bought these lots, all right? As I was saying before, Gross built what becomes Bowling Green, all right? Except that all of those houses were built way later, okay, in the beginning of the baby boom period, not when Gross was selling off those properties. Only like 5 houses in the entire neighborhood that were built at the time that he built it. There are also neighborhoods in East Meadow that are very clearly 20s. For instance, there's a Coolidge Street in East Meadow, or Drive Road something, okay? That is behind Friendly's, which of course is one of the most important places to know in East Meadow. The reason it's called Coolidge Drive is because it was built when Calvin Coolidge was president, okay? And it was impressive because if you lived on Coolidge, you could see the airplanes very clearly coming into the airfields that were just down the road, right? Where what became Mitchell Air Force Base. So, okay, and then in the 20s, so that was this guy Gross. Gross was Jewish, and so to compete with that, you have another group of investors who advertised exclusively in Catholic newspapers in the city and restricted their home sales to Catholics. And so they created the numbered street grid by the off of Prospect, and they created Prospect Avenue up to Hempstead Turnpike. And again, they only sold, in my book there's a map, and it only shows a few houses, right, being built in the 30s, but that was there. Then you get to the 50s. This is really fascinating. So the 1950s, you see all these properties being subdivided again. Anything that was not built up in the 20s was then purchased by another developer and built in the 50s. At that time, you also see all the farms, all these century farms being sold off for development. For instance, I live in a development called Wenwood Oaks, okay? This was built by Wenniger, all right? Anything on Long Island, starting with Wen Shaw, Wen Wood, Wen this, that, and all built by this guy, Sidney Wenniger. I spoke to his kid, Bruce, as there's a Bruce Drive in my neighborhood, and I know, right? All of these streets are named after the kids of the developers, by the way, all right? Kids and wives, things like that. For instance, Mr. Calvin Klein and David Teichholz, okay? Calda, like Calda Lane. So Calvin Klein and David Teichholz, for instance, like their kid was like Stephen Mark, okay? So like all these streets are named after their kids and their wives, like his wife was Sylvia, okay? Yeah, I know. So if you look at these streets, like, oh, this makes so much sense. So all these people were major developers, okay? The biggest developer in the 50s, of course, was Levitt, okay? But beyond, and Levitt built up all of Klein Deutschland. So almost all of that German area of East Meadow, right, which is now like the Salisbury and Levittown area there, that's all Levitt houses. He built up that whole area here. But here on this side of East Meadow, you have Jewish developers primarily, and also in Salisbury. And it really becomes really interesting because almost every single house in East Meadow was built by somebody of Jewish origin, except for the area by the water tower that I was explaining before. And what they did was they marketed heavily to their own demographic, right? And they built synagogues. And then they advertised that their homes were in walking distance from synagogues. Okay, so like East Meadow Jewish Center was built by the people who own the Newman Corporation there. So there is a Newman Lane, which ironically the rabbi lives on today. But that whole area, so you have Newman, and they were married to several developers in that whole area, in that whole section between like Prospect Avenue, Belmore Avenue, North Jerusalem Road, and East Meadow Avenue. And most of that's built by one family, basically. And they build East Meadow Jewish Center. And then their advertisements start reflecting that, right? So the character of that neighborhood becomes like very Jewish because of that. Same thing, you have Teichholz, Calvin Klein and David Teichholz building Lakeville Estates, which is like the Prospect School area, basically, right over here. And in 1950, they start this development. It's called Lakeville Estates because their original development is on Lakeville Road in Lake Success, okay? So there's still a Lakeville Estates sign over there. I work in Great Neck, so I passed it the other day. The houses are different, but it's the same thing. So you have them building there, and they build on plans of stuff that never happens. In the 20s, in the teens, that whole section was mapped out. If you look at a map, which I have, and I think it's in my book, all of these, the roads, they're all named after like fruits and trees and things like that, right? And then in the 50s, Lakeville Estates takes the roads that the town had planned out in the teens there, and they curve all of them because in the 50s, you have to build curved roads in suburbia. That was the thing to do because you don't want anybody driving too fast, right? Because kids are playing outside. So all of these spruce and all that, it's all original from like the teens, but they redid that in the 50s and they're building these houses there. Same thing in Salisbury. So you have up there's a Birchwood organization. They built much of Salisbury. They buy the Ladenburg property, basically, and they build hundreds of homes up in Salisbury. One of the guys involved with that was a guy named Shoe King Sam. All right. Shoe King Sam owned a drive-through shoe store on the corner of Newbridge Road and Hempstead Turnpike. Because it's the 50s, everything is drive-through, right? So if you're gonna buy shoes, I don't know how this worked, by the way. I guess you... So Shoe King Sam teams up with the organization that builds all those houses up there, and they decide they're gonna build a synagogue, right? It's Temple Shalom today, by the way, for those in that neighborhood. The original name of that synagogue is Birchwood, okay? Birchwood Jewish Center. So they build this, and the guy is like, we have to build this here, and how are we gonna get people to finance this? All right, well, he goes there, and he gets the bank to basically agree that everybody who takes out a mortgage, whatever, from this bank, they're gonna chip off a piece of this and build this synagogue, right? And then so he creates, and he makes a lot of money on his shoe business, all right? Unfortunately, his shoe store burns down a couple of years later. I know, insert the joke, not a soul was saved, right? Okay. I know, terrible. But that's that there. Now, that area of East Meadow also becomes predominantly Jewish, right? Because they build a synagogue. The developers of the homes build it with the people who live there, all right? And then same thing, the advertisements start reflecting that. So what happens is in East Meadow in the 50s, you get neighborhoods that are sort of homogenous, okay? And this lasts sort of through the 1980s in a lot of ways here in East Meadow. But what happens is, probably a huge chunk of my book goes through the history of the East Meadow School District. And in this 1970s, you have a really, really interesting development in the school district. The board gets taken over in the 1960s by an organization called the Independent Taxpayers of East Meadow. And they called themselves ITEM, the Independent Taxpayers of East Meadow. And they were an arm of the Republican Party here in East Meadow, officially so kind of thing. And the Democrats had an unofficial arm. They never actually were funded by the Democratic Party, but they were all Democrats, and they were known as the Good Government Group. Okay, so those were the two political factions that try to control the school district every year. Well, in the 70s, ITEM becomes really dominant on the school district. And so the school district's population in the 70s starts tanking, right? Because the baby boomers are sort of done with school, and now there's a lull. So the idea is let's close some schools to save $1 a year in taxes, because the independent taxpayers of East Meadow, they didn't care what services, essentially, except that taxes were going to be lower because we have fewer kids to educate. And that's not true for all of them. By the way, there was a rift in ITEM where you have people who were actually in it for the kids who were no, we're not doing this anymore. Yes, we want lower taxes, but we can't destroy our program. So I go through all this in the book. But, so they start closing schools. This lady, B. Bryson, was the president of the School Board Association at the time. I don't want to get into it here because, it's not always the most pleasant thing to talk about, but the things that she says on the public record in the school district minutes that I accessed and used for the book were basically the kids from Salisbury should see how the other half live, okay? Oh, well, too bad they're gonna lose their country club. They're not gonna be able to drive their Cadillacs to school anymore. So what they do in the 1970s is they close the most Jewish schools, okay? So, and you'll never find this on paper, except that I've spoken to people who were on the school board at the time, okay? And basically that's what happened. So the two buildings that they planned on closing in the 70s were Prospect Avenue Elementary School and Salisbury School, okay? And I don't need to draw a straight line to show you what the character of those neighborhoods was in the 1960s and 70s. So it becomes really fascinating. There's sort of this underlying religious rift going on in the neighborhoods because of it. And the Jews of Salisbury sue the school board, okay? And they lose because on paper, the school board is closing schools because the population is decreasing. And that's the prerogative of the school to do. So they lose their lawsuit. But what happens is after that, the character of the neighborhood totally changes. And a lot of people in the neighborhood start sending their kids to private school. It's really fascinating. So then they decided, this is looking really bad. So the school district's like, we probably shouldn't just close all the Jewish schools. So let's pick another one to close too, so that we don't look like anti-Semites. So they closed Newbridge Road School, which was the oldest building in the district, which was built in the 1920s. Right? That building still exists, by the way, because it's now apartments on Newbridge Road. So then in the 70s, you get all these buildings closing. And then in the 1980s, the school district, which started to turn, by the way, by that time, but their population was going down, so they closed McCleary Junior High School. All right? McCleary Junior High School used to be called Meadowbrook Junior High School. Meadowbrook Junior High School was renamed after McCleary, who was one of the standard bearers of the item organization. Okay? So you have at that time these sort of like a very, very dominant 1960s, naming these buildings after people from that organization. Anyway, so that building closes. Of course, 10 years later, Woodland is so overcrowded that a bond issue has to get passed in 2000 to build a wing onto that school. But we won't go there. Okay. So I found that story really fascinating. Just a few more minutes, because I know I said about 8:30. This right here is Mrs. Ladenburg, just back to Salisbury for a minute. She, of course, is riding a tank here. It's a World War I tank. She got married and became filthy rich, just like the Barnum, right? Just like people married into money. She married into money, and then her husband promptly died on a boat, okay, going to Florida. The husband was sick. Yeah, she was not on the boat with him, just to be fair. So the husband was sick, he had like tuberculosis or something like that, and the doctors were like, you should go on a cruise, right? Goes on a cruise, I don't know, a boat capsizes or something, the guy dies. He leaves. I forgot the number, and you'll excuse me for getting this wrong, but for some reason I think it's something like $7 million. And this is like 1900 whatever, okay? She becomes this like gazillionaire. So she's living here, and she becomes this philanthropist, basically. Her husband owned a banking like, so the husband was a banker, and he was associated with like the Rothschild banking industry, like in Europe. And then Thalman was his last name. Anyway, so she becomes like a billionaire, basically. This guy, John DeSalles, all right, this is another fascinating murder. This murder takes place in a house called The Box. The Box still stands. The Box is the oldest house in that neighborhood. It's on Bolson Drive, and it's the one that doesn't look like a 1950s house on Bolson Drive. So you could drive by there. And this was a domestic dispute. And so the wife was this really famous socialite, right? And she ends up, like, it was like the trial of the century. Like, if you're familiar with like the Evelyn Nesbit trial of like 1906, all right? Becomes this huge thing. She gets in trouble because she's fooling around with the guy, right? And so you have Rudolph Valentino involved in this. All right, which is not his original name, all right? But he changes his name to Rudolph Valentino after his involvement in this high-profile murder here in East Meadow, because he's never going to get a job with a name that's in the papers involved with this murder here. He was not the murderer, but he's like involved with this whole scenario, which we'll read about. So this is, again, you'll see Rudolph Valentino involved with this murder of the DeSalles. This is Mrs. DeSalles. What jury is going to convict that face? All right? Yeah. In fact, some of these murders, you saw like the women were in court. They're not even denying it. Like she's like, yeah, I killed him. Like, and the jury's like, oh my God, battered wife, right? So they all like, get acquitted of these crimes. And all of them seem to be like in like the Ladenburg property up there in Salisbury. So that's fun. This is The Box, famous picture from the county. That's Bolson Drive. Okay. Here's a picture of Elliot Roosevelt and his daughter Eleanor on his lap, right? That's taken here in East Meadow. I really like this picture. All right. Let's move forward a little bit. Last thing that we'll talk about really today before we wrap it up. This is Brookholt, right? So we're talking about all these like Gilded Age escapades. This is Brookholt Mansion. This is Mitchell Manor today. Okay, this is on Front Street, and it is behind the building that used to be Waldbaum's. All right, like just behind there, right over there. And this here was a Gilded Age. I don't know why I'm getting 3 copies of the same picture. I'm sorry. This is a Gilded Age masterpiece. So she gets involved, right, with the Vanderbilt family. And so at its core, Brookholt, all right, is like a Vanderbilt mansion here in East Meadow. And this, if you go up to like Newport, Rhode Island, right, like they have a house up there also. They've got houses all over the place. And she marries, right, Belmont. This guy, last name is Belmont. Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont. And of course, when you have 3 first names, you have to be rich. Like, that's the requirement. All right. So she marries this guy, O.H.P. Belmont. And of course, in good fashion, Mr. Belmont dies, right? So she inherits his property. And what are you going to do with this Gilded Age masterpiece when the Gilded Age is waning here, right? What you're going to do is you are going to be very progressive, and you are going to fight for women's rights. So she gets herself elected to the East Meadow School Board. She's the 2nd woman to be a board trustee, I think, on Long Island. And she's shocked that she wins, because people in East Meadow apparently were like, yeah, all right, well, she's rich, she's cool, we're going to vote for her. And she wins, I think it's like either unanimously or almost unanimously. She's like completely shocked. So she serves for 1 year as the school board trustee. It's like the school board president at the time. And she is actually really involved. She donates a flag to the school. She like opens her house, whatever. But the other thing that she does is that she creates an agricultural school for young women. So in 1911, she opens Brookholt's, right, or Belmont's School for Girls, basically agricultural school for girls is what the newspapers called it. And she builds this elaborate series. This is her, Mrs. Belmont. She builds this elaborate series of gardens, and that you can be used in the winter even, okay, where there's a garden larger than the property of your house, and it's enclosed in this enormous structure, and that structure was across on the north side of Front Street in what's now one of the senior developments today. And so she creates these winter gardens. You can see them here. And she creates outfits for these girls that are practical and stylish at the same time. Because although she's a feminist, she thinks that the women should still look good when they're farming. So this dress is blue, hard to tell from the black and white picture. So the dresses should be blue because that's a good color for a girl farmer, apparently, according to Mrs. Like literally, she said that. And the bonnets, everything's practical. They're wearing like these skirts that like have the, openings enough for them to actually farm. And she teaches these girls, essentially these young women, how to become farmers. And what's the purpose of doing this? They don't need to depend on a man to become a farmer, okay? That they can be their own, and they can be their own queen of their farm. And when she's doing this, she becomes an outspoken suffragette. So Mrs. Belmont opens up her home, and it becomes sort of like a local headquarters for like a women's suffrage movement. And she befriends some of like the major leaders at that time of the women's suffrage movement. And notably, she also befriends African-American leaders at the time. She's very progressive for her day. And she lives, this is just north of the Barnum property. And in fact, when her house was being built, she stayed with the Barnums, with Mrs. Barnum. From her 4th floor, she could watch the house being built. And then, so both of them were very progressive, both Mrs. Barnum and Mrs. Belmont. It only lasts a year, and then the whole enterprise folds, but it does become really famous. All right, last thing here. This is another Salisbury mansion, and that was originally, so it's the Eustace family is the family there. And this was right next to Salisbury School over there. And this was built on the property that was the Roosevelt property, all right, and just next to where their home used to be. And it's interesting, it was built by 3 Confederates. And they were in like show business. And then the house like falls into disrepair and eventually falls down. But you could see the size of, like if you were going to own a home in East Meadow at the turn of the century, like this is what you owned, like this was no shack. And again, these people, they owned horses, they raced them at the Meadowbrook Club. They were influential, all right? These were really quite influential people. And then what happens is, essentially in the 50s, all these developments get built, and you just have suburbia. And East Meadow becomes a place where people just move for suburbia, as you all know. But maybe some of you moved here because of that. And we become the third largest school district in the state. We had 19,000 students in the 1960s. Our school district. We have 7,500 students today by comparison, by the way. And it becomes really a big place to move to. The history of East Meadow, of course, is tied in with the history of Levittown, all right? And, you know, Belmore, and it's really hard to, like, separate that. Westbury, if you have a Westbury or Levittown address, right, you do not live in Westbury, I'm sorry. You live in East Meadow, which is a function of the way the post office set up their mail delivery at that time, all right? I think everybody in East Meadow should have an East Meadow address. It would just make it a lot easier. But people on that side got their delivery from Westbury, which is why Westbury gets a really, really expensive reputation at that time. And now, it's a little different. But back in like the 50s there, these places were advertised as Westbury South, right? These mansions were in Westbury. They were never in Westbury, right? But because their mail came from Westbury, it became associated with it. And Westbury was a very expensive place. Think old Westbury, right? So you're going to live there. And then, I'll leave you with this little quip. In the 1950s, one of my favorite silly topics is like telephone stuff, right? It's like I still have my phone number that I had when I was growing up as a kid, right? It's like Ivanhoe, okay? Yeah, so East Meadow, right, in the 50s, so up until like 1953, you could not dial directly anywhere. You had to pick up the phone and it's like, you know, Mary, get me like, you know, Junie next door kind of thing. But in the 50s, East Meadow became like a big place, and they started assigning like regular phone numbers, and you could start direct dialing people at that time, and then like you could dial long distance in East Meadow in 1959. But in order to do that, you needed to have a standard American phone number, right? So, which at that time was a name, right? You had an exchange name, and you had digits after that. All right. So Levittown, which was built starting in the late 40s, was a big place. So there was originally a Levittown exchange name, which doesn't exist anymore. And the part of East Meadow that got their phone serviced from that area, which today has Levittown, which today has, Levittown, like, addresses, the people there were like, we don't live in Levittown. We live in East Meadow. And they were so upset that the phone company had assigned them a Levittown exchange name because, God forbid, they should be associated with, like, the lower class in Levittown who didn't have basements. Literally, that's what people argued, okay? So they did not want their friends dialing Levittown on the telephone when they call them because they would think, like, confuse them for, like, living in Levittown, all right? So to make a long story short, those people got what they wanted. It was basically a battle of the dials there with the telephone company. And then at that time, the telephone company came in and they changed the names in this whole area because you were either getting your phone from, at that point, like Levittown, Wantagh, Hempstead. The problem with Hempstead exchange name, HE, was that it overlapped with exchanges in New York City because you didn't have to dial an area code at that time, right? So they had to change that. So in 1953, this whole area became Ivanhoe, all right, which is all the 4-8 numbers here in East Meadow. And then you have the pyramid numbers came in the center of East Meadow, and you had the Pershing numbers in what used to be the Levittown Exchange, and you had the sunset numbers down on the Belmore side of East Meadow, all right? And you had the Castle numbers up on the Carmen Avenue side of East Meadow, and you had the Edgewood phone numbers up in the Salisbury section of East Meadow. And so people were very protective of where they lived based on what their phones were, right? So it was like pretty exclusive to have like an ED phone number because you lived up in like the expensive Westbury section. But like God forbid you should be like Levittown, right? So I always thought like in the 50s that little socioeconomic thing was kind of fun. And that's what happened. So that's why your addresses are like their mail, your phones are all from like different areas. So that's that. Anyway, there's so much more. We could be here all night, but I hope you've enjoyed my little talk on East Meadow history. Thank you. Thank you. If you haven't already bought my new book and you would like to, no pressure, of course. I do have them here. I take Venmo, credit cards, cash, so they're at $24, plus the state is the pesky state with their legal stuff and taxes, and they make me collect the $2 in sales tax. Sorry, so there's that. If you're at home, hello everybody at home, you could go on my website, eastmeadowhistory.org or eastmeadowhistory.com. It just goes to the same place. And there's a link there to purchase the book using a credit card, and I'll send it to you, or we can find out a way to pick it up. And I'll be happy to sign the books afterwards, and I hope to see you around East Meadow. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night.